Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Children undergoing chemotherapy often face permanent hearing loss as a result of the toxicity of these treatments. The Children's Cause for Cancer Advocacy is organizing a patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA in September in the hopes of getting the agency to put greater consideration into the harmful effect these drugs can have and what it means for patients to lose their hearing. We spoke to Nawal Ouzren, CEO of Sensorion, which will participate in the FDA meeting and is developing a treatment for sudden hearing loss that may be able to help these patients. We spoke to Ouzren about the problem of hearing loss for children receiving chemotherapy, why regulators and others may dismiss it as an unfortunate price to pay for a life-saving therapy, and how Sensorion's experimental therapy may help prevent these children from going deaf. Nawal, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me and spending some time on this important initiative.
We're going to talk about hearing loss in kids who undergo chemotherapy, the extent of this issue, and how an experimental drug your company is developing may help to address that problem. I'd like to start with the problem itself, though. How common is hearing loss for children who undergo chemotherapy?
Yeah. So there are actually many drugs that are used commonly that will generate hearing loss because of ototoxicity. So you have an accumulation of toxic substances in the inner ear, in the cochlea, and then people will unfortunately become deaf. And one of these drugs is actually cisplatin that is very commonly used to treat solid tumors. It's a very efficacious treatment actually for children because we have a very high rate of survival for kids when they unfortunately suffer from solid tumors. So we have 80-90% survival rates, but unfortunately at the end of the chemotherapy cycles, between 50 to 60% of the children will end up deaf. So in terms of numbers, for children, because I think this is where the biggest unmet medical need is. It's around 8,000 kids in the U.S. and in Europe every single year.
And is this unique to children, or do adults undergoing the same treatment suffer the same consequences?
Yeah, so it's also, of course, valid for adults. Having said that, the survival rate with cisplatin in adult patient population is not the same as for children. And what we see in the medical practice is that if the patient is not responding after the first or the second cycle of chemotherapy, the doctors will switch treatment and, move to the second line or third line. So then it's somewhat more difficult to assess, the long-term impact of cisplatin because, they don't actually stick to a chemotherapy standard.
Well, what's happening in these cases? How does cisplatin damage the ability to hear?
Yeah, so during chemotherapy, you actually infuse cisplatin intravenous, and because of that, you will have an accumulation of the platinum in organs, not only the inner ears or in multiple organs. But what we observe, unfortunately, is that the accumulation of platinum in the cochlea will generate the death of the hair cells, which are very important for our hearing function. And then people, unfortunately, lose also the function of hearing and then become deaf.
And is this a temporary condition, or is this a permanent state?
For the 50 to 60% of people who will become deaf, or people, I would say children, it's permanent and irreversible.
You're working with the Children's Cause for Cancer Advocacy, a patient group that is helping to organize an FDA patient-focused drug development meeting. This is part of an ongoing effort to get the patient voice incorporated into FDA thinking. Is there a tendency for people who don't experience hearing loss to shrug it off as a small price to pay for a life-saving cancer treatment?
Yeah, so that's what we hear from the testimonies, of the patient families. So they were so grateful that actually this patient advocacy group that you just mentioned organized this very important initiative, because they wanted to make sure, that their voice were heard. And as you said, most of the time what we were hearing from them is that there is a shortcut. People just say, you should be grateful, your child is alive. And of course, I can understand, that first reaction, like after being diagnosed of a solid tumor or solid cancer, and, the child is actually saved thanks to cisplatin, and then, maybe becomes dead. For them, it's like, as you said, it's a small price. What I think people don't understand, the public doesn't understand, and maybe even in a certain extent, the FDA doesn't fully grasp, is like, what does it mean for a child to be deaf, to become deaf? Partly, when you are at this age of between 0 and 6 years old, where you should be at your peak in terms of learning development, when you can't hear anymore, it means, in particularly in Occidental countries, you can't learn to read, because the way we learn to read is that you associate the letters with a sound. It means also that your ability to acquire the language is jeopardized, for the younger kids. Even, we heard testimonies from younger adults, like 19 years old women, that were saying, if you would ask me between, picking, having the ability to give birth or hearing again, and she's 19 years old, she said, I'd rather be able to hear again. So for us, it was like, let's bring that voice, let's make sure that there is like a full light, so that people fully understand what does it mean to be a survivor of cancer with this type of adverse event.
What do these patients want regulators to understand?
I think number one is like, they want to educate the FDA and the public in a more general manner of what does it mean to live when you can't hear anymore, particularly when you were hearing. It's maybe different for congenital disorders. So the first is like education. Number two, for them, what success would look like is that, for new drugs that are being actually developed and being approved by the FDA, they would like the regulatory authorities to also assess the safety of these drugs and particularly toxicity. So we spoke about cisplatin, but there are other drugs, like aminoglycosides that are also very commonly used for cystic fibrosis patients. And we know that, cystic fibrosis patients, they suffer from pulmonary exacerbation, which is a very severe complication, and many of them will go through them. It's, I think, 17,000 patients every year in the U.S. only. And when you load them with aminoglycosides, we also know that there will be ototoxicity, and some of them will end up dead.
And do doctors generally discuss this with patients before embarking on treatment, or is it just lost in a long list of potential side effects?
Yeah, they generally, I would say generally they will discuss it. Most of the time also they will measure, the audition throughout the cycles of chemotherapy. But as you said, like, how much of this will actually trigger a change in the cisplatin chemotherapy treatment. I'm not sure. And at that point, I understand between jeopardizing maybe the efficacy of cisplatin versus the side effects. But I'm sure some of the oncologists will discuss it with the patients and have maybe a good conversation between the two of them. And some other oncologists will just take, the decision on their own and not change, for example, cisplatin, not reduce the dose.
Sensorion has a drug in development, Sens401. This is being developed for sudden hearing loss and as a potential treatment for people who lose their hearing because of chemotherapy. What is Sens401?
Yeah, so Sens401 is a 5-HT3 antagonist. It's an oral drug with some very unique calcineurin inhibition characteristic. And these two things are actually very important. So as you said, we are actually going to develop Sens401 for two indications. The first one is sudden sensory neural hearing loss. It's a unique disease. It's a rare disease. It impacts around 200,000 patients. So from one day to another, you actually lose a significant portion of your hearing in one of your ear. And in most of the time, it's irreversible too. And we were also very interested in our research efforts to understand ototoxicity. And we developed, ototoxicity or prevention of ototoxicity models. And we tested several candidates. And we tested among several candidates, we tested Sens401. And Sens401 came actually the strongest in our preclinical model in terms of efficacy. And in this case, is really prevention of the ototoxicity. So it's a 5-HT3 antagonist, and we inhibit calcineurin. And why it's important? When you look and you understand the apoptotic mechanism of action, you see that actually calcineurin is triggering the hair cell death. And when you inhibit calcineurin, it's like you slow down the hair cell process. And the apoptosis process actually lasts for 14 days. So the sooner you start inhibiting, the better it is for either the restoration of hearing or even the prevention of losing your hearing.
How exactly does the drug work?
So from what we understand, from the pathophysiology, when the accumulation of cisplatin in the cochlea will trigger a signal that will trigger the hair cell apoptotic process. And as I was telling you, what has been described most of the time is that this process will last, 14 days. What we also observe, for cisplatin-induced toxicity is that, sometimes, even after several months, you will continue to lose your hearing. So what we do with our drug is that when you trigger the hair cell apoptotic process, you actually change the homeostasis of the cells, and calcineurin is actually being released, and this actually generates and fuels the apoptotic process. When you inhibit and you remove the calcineurin, from the process, it's like you almost slow down, the hair cell apoptotic death, program death.
How did you come to see this as a potential indication for this therapy?
So we are a biotech. We specialize in the development of inner ear therapy. So we are very interested in either vertigo disease or hearing disease. And of course, the prevention of toxicity is a huge unmet medical need. So we have a platform, and we have actually a research team of 16 people working day and night, developing, in vitro and in vivo preclinical models to try to understand better the targets, the science of hearing, and test, different compounds. And as I said, Sens401 came from the sudden sensory neural hearing loss efforts. And of course, because we are very disciplined, we always test several candidates on our preclinical model. So for that prevention of ototoxicity model, we tested, among other candidates, Sensorion. And this is where we found out that the characteristics of that drug was preventing the hair cell death.
So this would be used prophylactically as opposed to treating a patient who suffered hearing loss after treatment.
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct, yeah.
What do you know from studies to date?
So I'll speak maybe about another company that is called Fennec Pharmaceuticals. It's a Canadian company, and that's a company that actually was the first one to execute clinical studies for the prevention of cisplatin-induced toxicity. So what was very important for us, observing that is that in some specific solid tumors, so they were not efficacious for every solid tumor, but in the hepatoblastoma, they were successful in demonstrating that they prevented the hearing loss at the end of the chemotherapy cycles. So this data and, looking at all the publications they've made also educated us better in understanding, what's happening when you have ototoxicity in your hair cells. And this, we of course then use that for our own preclinical models and also to actually design our clinical studies.
And what's the clinical path forward?
So right now we want to actually go in children immediately because we think this is where the biggest unmet medical need is, and the regulatory authorities agree with that. We actually got granted the orphan drug designation from the US FDA. We have to generate additional toxicology studies, and some additional data to make sure we understand really well the PK in pediatric population versus adult population. We'll be executing this in 2018 in the next 6 months. And if everything goes well, in 2019 you will see us starting dosing children.
And for people interested in the upcoming FDA Voice of the Patient meeting, where can they find out more about that?
Yeah, I would actually recommend them to go and look at the website of the patient advocacy group.
That's the Children's Cause for Cancer Advocacy?
Absolutely. They could also support them, financially. I think it will be an open meeting, so if they want to be educated as well, they could attend or listen afterwards through the webcast. As I said, really the purpose for us all together, with the families and the patient group and the industry, and Sensorion will not be the only company. There will be other companies supporting that cause. It's really to make sure that awareness is created around about the fact of living without hearing. And what we see now is that there are more and more data demonstrating that it's a huge problem, impacting very severely the quality of life of people. We actually, not only due to cisplatin or toxicity, but we are ahead of an epidemic. WHO just issued a report, raising the red flag, saying the way we live today is actually more noisy and people are going to be deaf by 40 years old. What we consider like grandma not being able to hear anymore with the presbyacousis, the way we listen to music, the way we live, in this very noisy environment, what we see is that people will lose their hearing by the age of 40. So it's a huge issue because not only you can't hear, what we see now, with actually additional publications is that there is a disproportionate risk for people actually being impacted by hearing loss. There is a disproportionate risk of developing dementia and Alzheimer's. Johns Hopkins actually just published a paper this year demonstrating that you were at, I think it was a 30% more risk. And that's something that you could actually intuitively understand, when you don't hear well, you isolate yourself because you're ashamed to actually ask people to repeat. And somewhat when you do that, you're less cognitively stimulated. And little by little doing that, maybe then something happens centrally in your brain. So I think it's time, to put some light on hearing and the fact that it's very important for the overall health of a person. And the science is getting ready. Companies are, getting mobilized in developing new drugs. And I think it's time for the industry to change standard of care.
Nawal Ouzren, CEO of Sensorion. Nawal, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and putting some light on that cause.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.